With 100 senators watching, with millions of Americans glued to their screens, J.D. Vance stood up, alone, and destroyed Mitch McConnell's plan live on national TV. The Senate chamber fell so silent you could hear a pin drop. What happened in that instant wasn't just a political clash. It was a moment that shook Washington to its very core. A single speech, a single stand, and nothing would ever be the same again. Today we take you inside that unforgettable moment, a dramatized account that captures the raw emotions, the impossible stakes, and the courage it took to defy an empire. While this story is a work of fiction inspired by real political dynamics, the passion, the struggle, and the moral questions it explores reflect truths that millions of working Americans face every single day. The emotions are real, the choices are real, and now, the battle begins. Stay with us as we uncover a moment that changed more than votes. It changed what America dares to believe. Rain lashed against the tall windows of J.D. Vance's Capitol Hill office, streaking the glass like the tears of a city weighed down by secrets. Outside, the marble steps of the Capitol gleamed wet under the dim evening lights, as if the storm had come to cleanse Washington itself. Inside, the room was quiet, but for the soft ticking of an old clock on the wall, a gift from a steelworkers union in Ohio. It was the kind of night that made even seasoned politicians feel the chill of the choices they'd made. J.D. sat at his desk, his hands resting on a thick stack of papers, the draft of a bill that, if passed, could change the lives of millions. The pages felt heavy, as if they carried not just words but the hopes of towns he had walked through. Towns that now stood silent except for the wind whistling through empty factories. Taxes on outsourcing, incentives for local factories. A chance for people to stay where their fathers and grandfathers had worked. He ran a hand through his hair, his pulse quickening. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm brewing in his mind. Could this really work? Could this piece of paper fight back against decades of deals that had hollowed out the heartland? A soft knock broke the stillness. It was Sam, his aide, young, idealistic, the kind of man who still believed the system could be saved. Sam stepped inside, dripping from the rain despite his coat. His eyes flicked to the bill in J.D.'s hands. "This could save us," Sam said quietly, almost afraid to hope too much. J.D. didn't look up right away. He let the words sink in, let them echo in the room like a challenge. Then, with a bitter smile, he replied, "Or get me buried in this town." The weight of truth hung between them. They both knew what this bill meant. It wasn't just legislation. It was a declaration of war, not against another country, but against the invisible empire of lobbyists, corporations, and backroom dealers who thrived on the silence of people like J.D. J.D. leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as rain hammered the roof. "They'll come for me. Every trick, every threat, every promise of power. They'll use it all to kill this." He could almost hear the phone calls that would start before sunrise, the veiled warnings, the deals dangled like poisoned fruit. But he also saw their faces, the faces of men and women in Youngstown and Dayton, in Steubenville and Toledo. People who had shaken his hand with calloused fingers, who had smiled at him with the hope of someone desperate for a reason to believe again. He saw the shuttered mill where his uncle once worked, the diner where a waitress whispered that her husband hadn't found steady work in 5 years. J.D.'s fingers tightened around the draft. Every line of text felt like a promise, or a lie if he didn't have the courage to see it through. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky, as if warning him of what was to come. Sam watched him, as if searching for the decision in J.D.'s eyes before he spoke it aloud. Finally, J.D. rose from his chair and walked to the window. He stared out at the Capitol, bathed in the storm's fury. "Let them come. Let them try. This bill," J.D. said, his voice low but steady, "is going to test what this town's made of. And what I'm made of, too." And in that moment, a flicker of defiance crossed his face. The kind of defiance that would soon set the stage for a showdown the nation never expected. As J.D. stood by the window, the storm outside battering the city, another kind of storm gathered just a few blocks away. While J.D. wrestled with conscience and hope, in a private room tucked deep within a government building, Mitch McConnell sat in the dim glow of a single desk lamp. The rain rattled the glass here too, but no one inside paid it any mind. For them, the real thunder came not from the skies. It came from deals made in low voices and the currency of promises. McConnell's hands rested calmly on the polished table as three men sat across from him. Their suits were expensive, their ties understated, their faces smooth with the confidence of men who rarely heard the word no. These were not politicians. These were the men who made politics dance. A lobbyist for a major manufacturing conglomerate, a strategist from a powerful trade association, a lawyer whose firm was known for writing legislation before Congress even saw it. The air felt heavy, as if soaked with the weight of what was about to be arranged. One of the lobbyists leaned forward, his voice little more than a breath. The bill dies quietly. We keep the donations flowing. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of terms, an exchange that had long defined how the city survived storms of reform. McConnell didn't flinch. His expression was as steady and unreadable as ever. He folded his hands, leaning slightly into the shadows that softened the harsh lines of his face. "It'll die," McConnell said, his voice dry as dust. "That bill will be nothing but a memory by the end of the month. Just another scrap on the floor of good intentions." The strategist offered a small, knowing smile, sliding a folded sheet of paper across the table. McConnell didn't need to open it. He knew what it contained: a list of names, commitments, favors to be called in. The machinery was already in motion. But in that quiet moment, as the rain streaked down the windows like the final act of a play too often performed, a younger aide, new enough to still feel the weight of consequence, hesitated. He spoke softly, as if afraid to break the spell. "Sir, Vance won't back down easily. He's not like the others." McConnell didn't look at him at first. He stared instead at the drops of water racing down the glass, as if measuring how long before they fell beyond sight. When he finally spoke, it was with a calm that carried a hint of warning. "Everyone backs down," he said. "It's just a matter of knowing where to press." The room sat in silence for a breath longer, the storm outside answering with a rumble that seemed to seal the agreement. And as McConnell gathered his papers, the pieces of the game set and ready, his thoughts turned, just briefly, to J.D. Vance, a man who, by sunrise, would begin to feel the weight of Washington's quiet war. The storm would pass, the city would dry, but the deals made tonight would linger, like the damp that settles deep and unseen until it rots the very foundation. And all the while, in his office down the avenue, J.D. Vance still stood at his window, unaware that the first moves against him had already begun. The rain had eased by the time McConnell's meeting ended, but the air over Washington still carried the weight of the storm. Its echo seemed to seep through the walls of the Capitol, settling over its grand corridors and silent offices. J.D. Vance, still at his desk long past the hour when most had gone home, felt that heaviness pressing down on him as he reviewed the bill's language one more time. Each clause, each provision, every line a fragile hope against the machine he knew was already turning against it. Outside his office, faint voices drifted down the hallway. At first, J.D. paid them no mind. The Capitol after dark was always a place of whispers, but something in the tone, low and eager, caught his attention. He rose slowly, stepping to his door, letting it stay just barely ajar as the voices became clearer. Two staffers, young and comfortable in the belief that no one was listening, leaned against a column near the stairwell. Their words were sharp with certainty, the kind that only comes when you think the game's already been won. "I'm telling you, McConnell's already lined it up. Vance's bill won't even see daylight by next week," one said, with a chuckle that grated against J.D.'s nerves. "The lobbyists must be paying double," the other replied. "No way he'd move this fast otherwise. They want it dead, and Mitch delivers, like always." J.D. felt his pulse quicken, a cold clarity settling in his chest. He'd expected resistance. He'd braced for pressure. But to hear it laid out so plainly, the betrayal already set in motion, the plan to crush what little chance the bill had, it struck him deeper than he cared to admit. He let the voices fade as the two moved on, leaving only silence and the soft hum of the Capitol's aging lights. J.D. returned to his desk, but the words on the pages before him no longer seemed enough. He pushed back the chair and crossed to the window. where the city spread out beneath him, the Capitol dome rising in solemn defiance against the night. He stood there for what felt like hours, his mind racing, torn between the loyalty expected of him and the conscience that had driven him to write the bill in the first place. He thought of the people who had put their trust in him, the workers with tired eyes, the small-town shop owners hanging on by a thread, the families who stayed in hollowed-out neighborhoods because leaving felt like giving up on something bigger than themselves. And he thought of the cost, the calls that would come, the doors that would close, the allies who would quietly step away. McConnell wouldn't need to shout or threaten. The system would do its work with a smile and a handshake, until JD found himself standing alone in a chamber that prided itself on silence when it mattered most. The night deepened, and still JD stared at the dome, the storm clouds breaking just enough for the moon's light to trace its outline in silver. He didn't sleep, couldn't. The decision loomed too large. By dawn, he knew the battle would no longer be about the bill alone. It would be about who he was and whether he could stand against the current long enough to make a difference. And as the first light crept over the horizon, JD clenched his fists at his sides, ready, if not certain, for the fight that waited. The first rays of dawn had barely touched the city when the summons came. JD hadn't slept. The weight of the night's revelations had kept him standing at his window, watching the Capitol as if he could draw strength from its unyielding silhouette. But now, as the sun rose and painted the marble in pale gold, he found himself summoned into the inner sanctum of the very machine he was preparing to defy. McConnell wanted to see him. The corridors of power were strangely quiet at that early hour, the usual bustle not yet begun. JD's steps echoed as he approached the office where so many ambitions had been made or broken. When the heavy door swung open, he was greeted not with fanfare or formality, but with the steady gaze of a man who had shaped the Senate for decades. Mitch McConnell sat behind his desk, the faintest ghost of a smile on his lips, as if already sure of the outcome of this meeting. JD, McConnell said, gesturing to the chair opposite him, his tone as smooth as silk. Come in. Sit down. JD hesitated only a second before lowering himself into the seat. The room was dim, curtains drawn against the morning light. The atmosphere felt close, as if the walls themselves were listening. McConnell steepled his fingers, studying JD the way a chess master studies a board before a decisive move. I admire your energy, your passion, he began, voice low, controlled. You've made quite the impression here. People talk about you. Bright future, they say. Very bright. JD held his gaze, wary but silent, knowing the real purpose of this meeting was still coming. McConnell's smile didn't waver. But my boy, let me give you a word of advice. You're ambitious, and that's good. This town rewards ambition, but don't waste it. Not on this. There it was, the soft edge of a threat, wrapped in the language of mentorship. McConnell leaned back slightly, his voice dropping further, forcing JD to lean in to hear every word. This bill of yours, it's a noble thought, but it's a dead end. The party protects its own when they stay in line. We all have to choose our battles. Choose wisely, JD. Don't let idealism blind you to reality. JD felt his pulse quicken, the words landing like stones in his gut. The offer wasn't direct, but it didn't need to be. The message was clear. Abandon the bill, stay in favor, and the road ahead would be smooth. Persist, and the machine would turn against him. For a long moment, silence filled the room. The only sound was the faint ticking of a clock on the wall, each second stretching longer than the last. JD met McConnell's gaze, searching for a flicker of doubt, of humanity. He found none, only the calm certainty of a man who believed he'd already won. Finally, JD rose, his chair scraping softly against the floor. His heart pounded, but his voice when he spoke was steady. Thank you for the advice, sir, but I think you know I can't walk away from this. McConnell didn't stop him as he turned to leave. He simply nodded, as if another piece had fallen into place in a game JD was only beginning to understand. Outside, as JD stepped back into the brightening day, the weight of the conversation settled on his shoulders. But so too did a deeper resolve. The line had been drawn, and now there was no turning back. The bright morning light of Washington had barely faded from JD's mind, when he found himself staring through the rain-smeared window of a worn-out sedan, miles away from the marble columns of the Capitol. The drive had been long and quiet, giving him time to turn McConnell's words over and over. A warning disguised as guidance, a promise of protection offered at the cost of his conscience. But here, in this former steel town, where the factory's chimneys stood like hollowed-out bones against the gray sky, that conversation seemed a world away. Here, reality spoke louder than politics. J.D. stepped out onto cracked pavement, the air thick with the ghost of industry, the scent of rust, of old oil, of promises long broken. The factory gates were chained shut, the paint on the sign so faded you could barely make out the name. A few houses still clung to life on the streets beyond, their windows watching with silent judgment. He hadn't been here in years, but nothing had changed, or maybe everything had. A figure waited for him at the gate, hands buried in a worn jacket, shoulders stooped under the weight of years and disappointment. The old worker, Walt they'd called him once, offered a small nod as J.D. approached. His hair was thinner, his face lined deeper, but the steel in his eyes remained, dulled but not gone. "Didn't think I'd see the day a senator'd bother coming back here," the man said, his voice rough, as if the dust of the mill still coated his throat. J.D. forced a smile, though guilt tugged at the corners of his heart. "Didn't think I'd have to, Walt. Thought by now this place would be humming again." Walt chuckled, a dry, bitter sound. He held out a hand, fingers twisted from years of hard labor, knuckles swollen, skin cracked where the cold had crept in too many winters. J.D. took it, feeling the strength that still lived beneath the damage. Without another word, Walt reached into his pocket and pulled out a small rusted pin, the kind worn on the caps of Union men, back when unions meant something in towns like this. He placed it in J.D.'s palm, closing the younger man's fingers around it. "Remind 'em who we are," Walt said softly. "When you're up there with the suits, when they tell you we don't matter, you remember this. You remember us." J.D. swallowed hard, the weight of the pin greater than it should have been. He glanced past Walt at the factory's silent walls, at the playground where a handful of kids kicked a dented can between puddles. Their laughter, thin and fleeting, echoed down streets lined with empty storefronts. He saw their parents in his mind, the ones who'd given up, who'd moved away, who'd stayed and watched their hopes rust like the gates behind him. The guilt burned deep, but with it came something fiercer, a fire he thought McConnell's office had tried to snuff out just hours before. "I won't forget," J.D. said, voice tight. "I swear it." Walt nodded once, the conversation done. J.D. turned back to his car, the pin clenched tight in his fist, as if letting it go would mean letting go of everything he'd come here to remember. And as he slid behind the wheel, the image of those kids lingered, a reminder of what was at stake and why surrender was no longer an option. The drive back from the steel town was long and silent, but J.D.'s mind was anything but still. Walt's words echoed with every mile, the weight of that rusted pin heavy in his pocket, as if it anchored him to a promise he hadn't fully understood until now. The sight of those children playing in hollow streets haunted him, their laughter thin against the backdrop of loss. By the time the city lights of Washington reappeared on the horizon, J.D. felt as if he were returning to enemy territory, a place where those faces meant nothing, where their struggle was reduced to footnotes in policy memos and talking points. The hotel room was quiet, too quiet, as he stared out at the city that never seemed to sleep. The rain had followed him back, a storm now building over the Capitol, the sky bruised with thunderclouds. J.D. barely had time to loosen his tie when the knock came at the door. Soft, polite, the sound of someone who didn't need to raise his voice to get what he wanted. J.D. opened it to find a man he recognized from whispered warnings, a lobbyist whose name carried weight, though rarely in public. Expensive suit, easy smile, eyes that saw too much. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, the scent of rain and cologne trailing with him. "Senator Vance," the man began smoothly, as if they were old friends sharing a quiet drink. "You've had a busy day." J.D. said nothing, letting the silence stretch. The lobbyist continued, undeterred. Let's not dance around it. You've got fire, I admire that. But fire burns out fast in this town. Unless it has fuel. He paused, studying JD the way a gambler studies the table before placing a bet. We can give you that fuel. Funding. Media cover. You'll look like the rising star they all say you are. All it takes is stepping back. Let this bill go quietly, and I promise you, the future's yours. JD felt his throat tighten, the temptation sharper than he'd expected. The offer wasn't crude. It was elegant, seductive. A lifeline that would let him keep his seat, his reputation, his dreams, without the fight that was sure to come. He thought of the calls he'd already begun to receive, the colleagues who had stopped meeting his eye in the halls. The weight of Washington's quiet war was real, and here was an easy exit, offered with a smile. But then he heard it, not in the room, but in his mind. The siren that had once wailed shift changes at the mill. The sound that meant work, purpose, dignity. A sound that had been silent for years. A sound stolen from towns like the one he'd just left. JD turned to the window, the storm outside now lashing the glass. Rain streaking down like the tears of a city forgotten. Thunder cracked in the distance, the Capitol caught in the flash of lightning. He felt the pin in his pocket, the metal cold against his fingers. No, JD said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm raging within and without. I won't betray them. The lobbyist didn't argue. He only nodded, as if he'd expected this answer but had to try anyway. You're making it harder than it needs to be, he said, before slipping out the door, leaving JD alone with the rain and his resolve. And as the storm battered his window, JD knew the real tempest was only just beginning. The storm had not yet passed when JD awoke, though he was no longer sure he'd truly slept. The night had been filled with the steady drum of rain on the window and the weight of everything that had unfolded. The offer, the temptation, the quiet resolve that had grown stronger with every passing hour. By dawn, his decision was clear. He had tried to play by their rules, to fight within the lines they drew. But those lines were traps, and the only way forward now was to break free of them entirely. He dressed with slow purpose, every movement measured as if suiting up for battle. The pin from Walt stayed in his pocket, its presence grounding him. Outside, the city was waking, but in JD's mind, it felt like the calm before the real storm. He picked up the phone, dialing a number he knew by heart. A journalist he trusted, one who still believed that the truth mattered, even in a town built on shadows. When the voice on the other end answered, JD didn't hesitate. He spoke quietly, but the words carried the weight of everything he was risking. He laid it all out. McConnell's plan, the backroom deals, the promises made behind closed doors, the betrayals. When he finished, there was a long pause, and then the journalist simply said, "You realize this is war." JD exhaled slowly, as if releasing the last of his doubts. "Yeah," he said, "I do." By midday, the headlines had begun to spread like wildfire. The betrayal of America's workers, insider leaks plot to kill jobs, bill Senate power struggle erupts. JD's name wasn't in the stories, not yet. But those who knew, knew. The leak had cracked the facade of unity, and beneath it, the fractures widened with every hour. McConnell's office went into overdrive, the corridors of the Capitol thick with the sound of hasty meetings and raised voices. Allies demanded explanations. Enemies saw opportunity. McConnell himself, so often the image of quiet control, was seen storming out of his office, jaw tight, eyes hard. The machine he had built over decades was lurching, the gears grinding where they were meant to turn smooth. JD watched it unfold from a distance, seated in the corner of a quiet cafe where no one paid him much mind. The television above the counter replayed the headlines, the anchors' voices filled with the breathless excitement of a political drama breaking in real time. He stirred his coffee slowly, the bitter taste a small price to pay for the clarity that now filled him. But he knew this was only the beginning. The leak was a shot fired, loud, public, impossible to ignore. The retaliation would come, swift and merciless. The calls would start, the threats would follow. His colleagues would shrink away, afraid of the storm he'd unleashed. Still, as he left the cafe and stepped back into the rain-soaked streets, JD felt no regret. He had chosen his side, and whatever came next, he would face it with the same quiet resolve that had carried him this far. Above him, the Capitol loomed against the clearing sky, the storm clouds breaking, but the real battle had only just begun. The cafe's door had barely closed behind JD when the storm found him again. Not just the rain that still clung to the city, but the storm he'd set loose with his leak. By the time he reached his office, the quiet of the early morning had given way to chaos. His aide, Sam, stood in the doorway, arms full of envelopes, his face pale beneath the fluorescent lights. "They're coming in by the hundreds," Sam said, voice tight, as if he couldn't decide whether to be amazed or afraid. "Emails, calls, letters. It hasn't stopped all morning." JD took a step inside, and the sight stunned him. His desk was buried beneath stacks of messages, some scrawled in anger, others in gratitude. The weight of them felt like the weight of the nation itself. Every fear, every hope, every demand for him to stand firm or stand down. He picked up the nearest envelope, the handwriting neat but forceful. "Traitor," it read, the words stark on the page. The next was no better. "You've made a powerful enemy. Walk away while you still can." The third stopped him. A simple card from a town he'd never visited. Inside, a short note. "My father lost his job when the plant closed. Thank you for fighting for us. Don't stop." JD set it down carefully, as if the paper itself were fragile. Around him, the storm of opinion roared on. The media dissected his every move. Colleagues whispered behind closed doors, and the phone rang endlessly. Some calls JD answered, most he didn't. He knew what they would say. The lines had been drawn. There was no middle ground left. Sam placed the last of the letters on the pile, watching JD closely. "They're going to crush you," he said finally, his voice low but steady. There was no fear in it now, only certainty, the kind that came when you saw how power worked in this city. "McConnell, the donors, the party. You've made them bleed, JD. They won't forgive that." JD didn't answer at first. He turned to the window, the Capitol visible through the rain-streaked glass, solid and unyielding as ever. The storm outside mirrored the one in his mind, but beneath the noise, a strange calm had taken hold. He felt the pin in his pocket again, the rough edge of its rust against his skin. He remembered the faces in the steel town, the children's laughter too small against the empty streets, and he knew the answer as surely as he knew his own name. "Let them try," JD said, the words quiet but firm, carried not on defiance alone, but on the certainty that he had chosen the only path left to him. Sam didn't argue. There was nothing left to say. Later, as the day gave way to dusk, JD stepped out into the storm once more. The rain beat down harder now, the city's lights blurred behind a curtain of water. He walked alone, no destination in mind, only the need to feel the ground beneath his feet, to remind himself that he still stood. Each step echoed his resolve, the storm washing over him, but failing to drown what it sought to break. And as thunder rolled above, JD lifted his face to the rain, finding strength not in shelter, but in the storm itself. The storm that had soaked Washington seemed to follow JD all the way to Ohio, as if nature itself mirrored the unrest stirring across the nation. But by the time he stepped onto the stage of a modest town hall, the rain had finally eased, leaving behind air heavy with anticipation in the scent of damp earth. The room was packed, standing room only, filled with faces JD couldn't forget even if he tried. These were the people he'd been fighting for, the ones who bore the scars of decisions made far from their homes, far from their lives. The crowd quieted as he approached the microphone. He could see the weariness in their eyes, the weight of disappointment carried too long. But he also saw something else, a flicker of hope that terrified him more than any threat McConnell could deliver. Because that hope was fragile, and if he failed them now, it might not return again. JD gripped the podium, steadying himself. He spoke without notes because no speechwriter could have captured what needed saying. His voice, raw from sleepless nights and relentless storms, carried through the hall with a clarity born of conviction. "I know you've heard promises before," JD began, eyes sweeping the room. I know you've watched them break, one by one, until trust seemed like a fool's game. But I didn't come here tonight with promises. I came here with a fight. And I came to tell you I won't back down. Not now. Not ever. The room was silent at first, the weight of his words settling like the storm's last drops. And then she stood, a mother near the front, her coat worn, her eyes brimming with tears that refused to fall until this moment. She clutched a photo in trembling hands, the image of a boy no older than 10, smiling in better days. "You gave us hope," she said, her voice breaking as the tears finally came. "That's more than anyone's given us in a long, long time." Her words cracked something open in the room. The silence broke, replaced by the murmur of voices finding strength together. Then louder. A chant began at the back, small at first, but growing with every voice that joined. "Pass the bill! Pass the bill!" It filled the hall, a sound more powerful than any speech JD could give. He felt it rise around him, felt the desperation in it. Not anger alone, but the deep, aching need to believe again, to see action where there had been only words. JD stood still, letting the chant wash over him like the storm's rain, his heart pounding with the rhythm of their voices. He looked at the mother, at the boy's photo, at the faces turned toward him not as a politician, but as a last chance. In that moment, he felt the full weight of their trust, and it was heavier than any threat McConnell or the lobbyists could wield. It was heavier because it mattered. As the chant echoed into the night beyond the town hall's walls, JD knew the battle ahead would test him more than he'd ever imagined. But for these people, for this moment, surrender was no longer a word he could afford to know. The chants from the Ohio town hall still echoed in JD's mind as he stepped onto the quiet streets of Washington. The city, so often loud with the hum of power, felt different at this hour, as if it, too, had paused to consider what came next. The storm had passed, but puddles glistened beneath the streetlights, and the air smelled of rain and stone, a reminder of battles fought long before his. JD walked without speaking, without a destination, needing the rhythm of his footsteps to steady the rush of thoughts that filled his head. The Capitol dome loomed behind him, bathed in pale light, but it was not toward the seat of power that his feet carried him. Instead, they drew him toward the Lincoln Memorial, its columns rising like silent sentinels against the night. It felt right to come here, to this place where words carved in stone had outlived the men who spoke them. Words about unity, about sacrifice, about a nation that might yet redeem its soul. JD climbed the steps slowly, his shoes leaving damp prints on the worn marble. He felt the weight of the Union pin in his pocket, the metal cold against his fingertips. He drew it out and turned it over in his hand, tracing the rusted edge with his thumb. In the stillness of the night, the faces of those he'd met, the mother clutching her son's photo, the steelworker with his broken hands, came back to him as clearly as if they stood beside him now. He stood before Lincoln's statue, the great figure seated in timeless vigil, eyes fixed on a future neither of them could fully see. JD let the silence fill him, let it drown out the noise of politics and power plays, the threats and the promises. Here, none of that mattered. Here, what mattered was the promise he had made. Not in speeches, but in his heart. He gripped the pin tighter, feeling the sharp point bite into his skin. It grounded him, reminded him why he had chosen this fight, reminded him of the people who had trusted him to stand when so many had turned away. "I won't betray you," JD whispered, the words meant for those who couldn't hear them, for those who waited far beyond these marble steps. The wind caught his voice, carrying it into the night where it mingled with the memory of other promises, other struggles. He stayed there, unmoving, for what felt like hours. The city spread out before him, quiet and waiting. The night was deep, but dawn would come soon enough, and with it, the next battle. He knew the calls would begin again. The pressure would mount, and the machine would do its work, tireless and relentless. But for this moment, here beneath Lincoln's gaze, JD let himself believe that courage still counted for something. When at last he turned to go, the pin remained clutched in his hand, its rust staining his palm like a brand. The steps echoed beneath his feet as he descended, each one a promise renewed, that whatever came, he would not bend, he would not break, And as he walked back into the city's waiting shadows, the storm within him had found its purpose. The night still wrapped Washington in its quiet grip as J.D. made his way back from the Lincoln Memorial. The storm had left behind a city washed clean, but inside him the storm raged on. His steps slowed as he reached his office, the glow of a single desk lamp spilling across papers and unopened letters. The union pin rested on the desk where he placed it gently, as if afraid to tarnish its meaning with the clutter of politics. For a moment he stared at it, then at the Capitol beyond the window, before his gaze drifted to the framed photo that had always stood at the edge of his desk. His wife and their son, their smiles unguarded, untouched by the weight he carried now. The need to hear her voice tugged at him, stronger than the pull of duty, stronger than the exhaustion that gnawed at his bones. He picked up the phone, his fingers pausing just briefly on the keypad, as if to steady his resolve before dialing the familiar number. The ring seemed to echo too loud in the stillness, and then she answered, her voice soft with sleep but warm with recognition. "J.D.?" she asked, the simple word carrying more comfort than any speech, any promise he had heard all week. "They're coming for me," J.D. said, the words slipping out before he could dress them in the armor of political language. No spin, no strategy, just the raw truth as it lived inside him. "It's begun. The calls, the threats. They won't stop until they've broken me, or the bill, or both." For a heartbeat, there was only the hush of the line between them. Then her voice came steady, stronger than he'd expected. "Then meet them head on. That's who you are. That's who we've always known you to be." J.D. closed his eyes, letting the weight of her words settle over him like a shield. He could almost see her as she spoke, could see the set of her jaw when she was determined, could see the fire in her eyes when she spoke for what mattered. Her strength lent him his own. "I don't want you or him to have to see what's coming," J.D. admitted, his voice low, the fight in him meeting the fear that never quite left. "The machine's going to try and grind us down, and I don't know how far they'll go." "We're not afraid of shadows," she said. "We're with you. Just don't lose yourself in the fight. Don't forget why you started it." J.D. let out a slow breath, feeling the tension in his chest ease, if only slightly. His gaze returned to the photo on his desk, his son's smile, bright and unguarded, a reminder of a future not yet written, a future worth the battle. "For his future," J.D. said quietly. The words not just for her, but for himself, an anchor against the storm. He felt the promise settle deep, where no threat could reach it. They spoke a little longer, voices soft in the night, sharing strength in the spaces where fear tried to creep in. When he finally set the phone down, J.D. felt the storm outside had finally matched the one inside him. Not gone, but focused. And as he turned back to the window, the city lay before him, waiting for what came next. He was ready to meet it. The first light of dawn painted the edges of the Capitol in muted gold, but the city beneath it felt anything but new. J.D. stood for a long moment at his window, the quiet from his late-night calls still wrapped around him like armor. His wife's words, his son's smile, both gave him strength, but they could not stop what was coming. He knew the machine would make its next move soon, and it did not make him wait long. He hadn't planned on leaving his office yet, but instinct drew him into the corridor, the stillness of the early hour offering a brief illusion of peace. That illusion shattered the moment he saw Mitch McConnell waiting at the far end of the hall. Alone, without aides or allies, McConnell stood with the patience of a man who had spent his life mastering the art of choosing the exact moment to strike. J.D. kept walking, unwilling to slow, unwilling to give ground. The space between them closed, and when they stood face to face, the silence was louder than the storm had been the night before. McConnell spoke first, his voice soft enough that it forced J.D. to listen, but firm enough to carry the weight of power behind it. "Withdraw, and you'll still have a future," he said, the words delivered without anger, without malice, as if he were offering J.D. a gift rather than an ultimatum. "You're young, you're talented, you don't have to throw it all away on this." J.D. felt the weight of the moment press down on him, but his feet stayed planted, his gaze steady. He thought of the union pin now warm from the touch of his hand, of the mother's tears in that Ohio town hall, of his wife's voice telling him to meet the storm head-on. "You think this is about my future?" JD asked, his voice quiet but steady, the steel in it unshaken. "Tomorrow I fight for them. That's the only future that matters." McConnell's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes flickered. Perhaps disappointment, perhaps calculation. He stepped slightly closer, enough that JD could see the fine lines time had carved into his face, the weight of years spent shaping this city's machinery. "You don't understand what you're inviting," McConnell said, and for a moment the polish of the practiced politician slipped, revealing the edge beneath. "They'll destroy you, piece by piece, and when they're done, there'll be nothing left to fight for." JD didn't flinch. He felt the tension crackle between them, the storm now reduced to two men standing at the heart of it, neither willing to yield. "Then let them try," JD said, his voice low but resolute. "I'd rather fall fighting than stand with the ones who forgot who they serve." For a long moment neither spoke. The hallway seemed to hold its breath, as if the building itself sensed the weight of the choice that had just been sealed. Then without another word, McConnell stepped back, his face returning to the mask of calm control he wore so well. He turned and walked away, the sound of his footsteps fading into the hush of the Capitol's dawn. JD stood alone, the echoes of that encounter lingering like the final rumble of distant thunder. The battle was no longer coming. It had arrived, and tomorrow it would be fought in full view of the nation. Morning broke over Washington with a sharp, clear light that seemed to cut through the remnants of the storm. The Capitol stood pristine beneath the rising sun, its marble columns gleaming as if untouched by the turmoil churning within its walls. But inside, the air was thick with anticipation, with the weight of a day that would not be forgotten. The corridors hummed with hurried steps, whispered strategies, and the soft clatter of reporters setting up along the press gallery. Every camera lens was trained on the Senate chamber. Every microphone waited to catch the words that would decide the course of the fight. The chamber itself filled slowly at first, senators arriving in pairs or small groups, their conversations low, their faces carefully composed. Some wore the expression of those who had already chosen their side, others the look of people wishing they could be anywhere else. The press gallery buzzed above them, the hum of equipment and quiet chatter, a steady backdrop to the drama about to unfold. The nation watched through screens large and small, from living rooms, break rooms, and factory floors, eyes fixed on a place that for too long had seemed distant from their lives. JD entered without fanfare, the doors parting as he stepped inside. The noise of the chamber dulled for a moment as heads turned, gazes sharp with curiosity, judgment, or quiet support. He felt their stares, some cold, some cautious, a few warm, but he let none of it touch the steady rhythm of his stride. He walked with the weight of what he carried, but also with the knowledge that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The Union pin rested against his heart, its presence a reminder of the voices that had sent him here, of the promises that could not be betrayed. He took his seat, his eyes scanning the room not with defiance but with resolve. He saw the faces of those who had stood beside him before the storm began, and those who had stepped back when it broke. He saw the cameras, the pages shuffling papers at the edge of the chamber, the nation's attention focused on a place where so often nothing of consequence happened. But not today. Across the floor, McConnell watched him, a small, practiced smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. To the casual observer, it might have seemed like confidence, but JD saw it for what it was, the expression of a man who believed he had already won, who trusted in the machinery he'd spent a lifetime building. McConnell gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, as if acknowledging the formality of what was about to unfold before the inevitable end. JD didn't return the gesture. Instead, he let his gaze rest on the gallery above, on the cameras that would carry every word, every glance, every pause to a country waiting for more than politics, waiting for a sign that someone still remembered what it meant to stand and fight. The chamber settled as the final senators entered, the low murmur of voices falling away. The weight of history, of decisions made in moments like these, filled the space between them all. And as the presiding officer called the chamber to order, JD drew a steady breath, ready to face what came next. not for himself, but for those who had placed their hope in him. The chamber had settled into a hush so complete that the faint creak of a chair or the shuffle of a paper echoed louder than any voice had all morning. The presiding officer gave the floor to J.D. Vance, and as he rose, the weight of the moment settled on him like the storm clouds that had followed him for weeks. The nation watched. The press poised their pens. The Senate waited, some with expectation, some with dread, some with indifference that masked unease. J.D.'s hands closed once more around the union pin in his pocket, the cool metal grounding him, reminding him of why he was here. He stepped forward, every eye drawn to him, and began to speak. His voice at first was calm, steady, carrying across the chamber without strain, without force, but with a clarity that made even those who had planned to tune him out lean in. "We have come to a moment," J.D. began, his gaze sweeping across the room, catching the eyes of friend and foe alike, "when we must decide what kind of nation we choose to be. Not in speeches or slogans, but in the choices we make right here, right now. We can sell our soul for dirty dollars, or stand for those who built this nation." A ripple went through the chamber, not of noise, but of attention sharpening. He had their ears and they knew it. J.D. continued, his voice rising with the fire he'd kept contained through every threat, every offer, every sleepless night. "I've walked the streets of towns hollowed out by deals made in rooms like this. I've looked into the eyes of men who lost not just their jobs, but their hope. I've held the words of a mother who asked only that her son might have a future. And I've stood in the shadow of this building and wondered whether it still remembers who it was built to serve." He paused, not for effect, but because the truth of his words tightened his throat. Then he pressed on, stronger still. "We like to tell ourselves that nations fall to enemies at their gates. But that's not true. Nations fall to silence. Nations fall when the people trusted to speak, to stand, choose comfort over courage. Nations aren't saved by silence. They're saved by courage." The words filled the chamber, lingered in the air, seemed to press against the walls themselves. J.D. saw the shift, the way shoulders straightened, eyes glistened, the way the usual mask of disinterest slipped, if only for a moment. Even among those determined to vote against him, something in his voice had reached them, reminded them of what they'd once claimed to believe. His final words came quieter, but no less fierce. "So today I ask you, which side of history do you want your name written on? The side that gave in, or the side that stood up?" When he finished, silence held the chamber tighter than any gavel's rap could have. The usual shuffle, the murmur of side conversations, the scripted gestures of a body accustomed to show over substance, all of it vanished. For that breath of time, J.D.'s words had cut through it all, and as he returned to his seat, he felt the eyes of the nation still on him, felt the weight of their hope, their fear, their quiet prayer that, for once, courage might carry the day. The silence that followed J.D.'s speech hung over the chamber like a held breath, as if the very walls waited to see what would come next. Senators shifted in their seats, but no one spoke. The presiding officer's voice broke the stillness at last, calling the chamber to the vote. The gavel struck wood, a sound sharp and final, and the process began. Slow, methodical, each name called in turn, each response added to the tally that would decide not only the fate of a bill, but the shape of a nation's conscience. J.D. sat motionless, his hands clasped tight, the union pin pressed between his fingers, as if its worn edges could somehow anchor him to the moment. His gaze swept the room, noting every hesitation, every glance exchanged, every subtle tremor of conscience at war with calculation. The sound of each vote cast echoed louder than any speech, louder than any debate. A simple yes or no, carrying the weight of all the lives tethered to this decision. Outside the chamber, the gallery above and beyond the walls of the Capitol held its collective breath. Workers in break rooms, families in living rooms, old men at diner counters, and children watching beside parents who tried to explain why this mattered. All waited, hearts pounding in time with the roll call that seemed to stretch into eternity. J.D. felt the tension with every beat of his heart, the seconds drawn long and thin as wire. The votes came in, the numbers tight, the margin razor thin. Every voice that said yes felt like a lifeline. Every no, a stone placed in the path of hope. The final tally crept closer, the outcome teetering on the edge of a knife. He saw McConnell's smirk fade, his confidence erode, replaced by something colder, harder. The look of a man seeing his hold slip by fractions beyond his grasp. And then it came. The final vote. A single yes that tipped the balance, that transformed a deadlocked chamber into a place where history had been made. The bill had passed. By one vote. One voice that chose courage over silence. The gallery erupted. Applause thundered down from above. Not the polite clapping of political routine, but the raw, unguarded outpouring of people who had watched too long without seeing change. The sound filled the chamber, drowned out the stunned silence of those who had opposed, swept over JD like a wave he hadn't known he'd been waiting for. He stayed seated for a heartbeat longer, overwhelmed by the flood of relief, of gratitude, of the sheer enormity of what had just happened. His lungs drew in air, as if for the first time in days. He felt the pin in his hand, and knew its promise had been honored. Across the room, McConnell gathered his papers with deliberate care, his face a mask of composure cracked only at the edges. Without a word, he turned and exited the chamber, his retreat unnoticed by many, but not by JD. Their eyes met for the briefest of moments, a silent acknowledgement that the fight had been real, that the battle had been waged, and that today courage had won. JD stood at last, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion, but lifted by something stronger. The knowledge that he had kept faith with those who believed in him, and that for one moment, one vote, the voice of the forgotten had been heard. The echoes of the gallery's applause still seemed to hum in JD's ears as he left the chamber that day, but it wasn't long before the weight of what had followed that single vote began to press in. The halls of the Capitol, which had once felt like the beating heart of the nation's promise, now felt colder, narrower, lined with the silent judgments of colleagues who turned their eyes away as he passed. Where once there had been nods, greetings, the polite exchanges of political allies, now there was distance, the kind that spoke louder than words. Doors that had been opened now closed quietly as he approached. Conversations hushed at his presence, replaced by the soft click of keyboards, the shuffle of papers, the pretense of work that masked unease. JD walked those corridors with his head high, but he felt the isolation settle on his shoulders heavier than any storm. He understood what it meant. He had stepped outside the lines, defied the quiet agreements that kept the machinery of Washington running smoothly. And now the machine had turned on him. The media played its part as expected. Headlines that once called him a rising star now questioned his judgment, his loyalty, his very character. Pundits took turns dissecting his speech, his vote, his motives, painting him as reckless, naive, or worse. A man too eager to burn bridges to satisfy some personal crusade. The talking heads debated not the bill's impact, but JD's future. Their voices smooth with the confidence of those who never risked their own names. But outside those walls, beyond the reach of polished sound bites and insider sneers, something else was happening. The people JD had spoken for, the ones whose voices had too long been drowned out by the noise of politics, began to rise. Rallies grew in towns and cities JD had visited, and in places he hadn't. Crowds gathering in union halls, on courthouse steps, in parks and parking lots, holding signs that said what they felt. JD speaks for us. Their voices, unpolished and sincere, filled the air with chants that carried beyond the cameras, beyond the Capitol's stone walls, beyond the carefully managed narrative of those who sought to bury what had been won. JD felt their support in the letters that still arrived by the dozens, in the calls that flooded his office from people who asked nothing but that he keep standing, keep fighting. Each note, each voice reminded him that the price he was paying in Washington's cold corridors was worth it, that the bridges he'd burned were bridges that led nowhere he wanted to go. As he moved through the Capitol, through the city, through the storm of criticism and quiet disdain, he carried their words with him, let them fuel the fire that no smear or shun could snuff out. He knew the battle wasn't over, that the victory had been only a beginning, that the real work would be harder still. But in the chant of the crowds, in the rising chorus that refused to be silenced, JD found the strength to face whatever came next. And as the sun set behind the Capitol dome, casting long shadows over a city divided, JD Vance kept walking, steady, resolute, and unafraid. The weight of Washington's cold corridors still clung to JD as he left the city behind, the plane carrying him westward, toward the place where his fight had begun. The Capitol's marble halls, the polished floors that now echoed with the silence of colleagues who turned their backs. They felt distant, like the memory of a storm after the clouds had cleared. But JD knew the storm wasn't over. The machine might have lost the vote, but it hadn't given up. Even so, as the miles fell away beneath him, a different weight filled his heart. The weight of the people who still believed. Ohio greeted him with a sky wide and clear, the air cool and clean in a way that made him breathe deeper, as if the very land offered strength. JD stepped from the car in front of the old factory gates, their rusted iron now less a symbol of defeat and more a monument to what could be rebuilt. The same worker who had given him the pin, Walt, with his stooped shoulders and battered hands, stood waiting, as if he'd known JD would come. The yard beyond was empty, but for a small group of workers and families who'd gathered quietly. No cameras, no press, just faces JD recognized. Faces lined by hard years, but lit now with something that looked a little like hope. Walt stepped forward, no speeches, no formalities. His eyes met JD's with the steady gaze of a man who had seen too much to waste words. In his hands he held a small wooden plaque, simple, unadorned, save for the engraving burned into its surface. Walt held it out, and JD took it with hands that trembled before the gesture's quiet power. "For courage beyond politics," Walt said, the words spoken plain, but carrying the weight of everything that had passed between them. "You didn't have to, but you did." JD stared at the plaque, the grain of the wood rough beneath his fingers, the letters cut deep as if to last longer than any speech or headline. His throat tightened. The emotions of the past weeks, the fight, the fear, the isolation, all rising to the surface where he could no longer hold them down. He tried to speak, to thank them, to tell them it wasn't over, that the real work was still ahead. But the words caught, lost beneath the wave that crashed over him. He wept then, quietly, the tears slipping down without shame, without hiding. The people stood with him, saying nothing, offering not sympathy but solidarity. They understood. They had fought their own battles, had stood in their own storms, had learned that sometimes the only answer was to stand steady and let the rain fall. JD wiped his eyes, drawing a breath that steadied his voice. "I didn't do it alone," he said, voice low but sure. "I never could have, and I won't stop. Not now." Walt nodded, a small smile breaking the lines of his face. "We know." As JD turned to leave, the plaque in his hand and the weight of their trust in his heart, the factory stood silent still, but no longer dead. It waited, as they all did, for the work ahead. And JD, humbled, ready, walked toward it, knowing this was only the beginning. The quiet of JD's office greeted him like an old companion when he returned to Washington. The familiar space unchanged by the battles he had fought beyond its walls. The desk was as he'd left it, neat save for the stack of letters that continued to arrive, words from strangers who no longer felt like strangers at all. The window framed the Capitol dome against a sky turning to dusk, the last rays of the sun casting long shadows across the city that had tried and failed to break him. JD stood for a long moment, letting the stillness settle around him. The plaque from Ohio rested on the corner of his desk now, its simple engraving catching the fading light. "For courage beyond politics." The weight of it stayed with him, not as a burden, but as a reminder, as a promise made and kept. His gaze drifted to the chair where he'd spent too many sleepless nights, to the papers that outlined bills and policies and strategies, and finally to the small object he'd carried in his pocket through every step of the fight. The Union pin, worn and rusted, its edges softened by time, lay where he'd placed it beside the plaque. JD picked it up, feeling again the cool metal against his skin, the roughness of it grounding him in the truth he had chosen to live by. He turned it over in his fingers, thinking of the factory gates, of Walt's steady eyes, of the mother's tears, of the chants that had filled the town halls and the streets beyond. He thought of the colleagues who no longer met his gaze, of the headlines that still questioned his motives, of the machine that would keep turning, looking for ways to grind him down. And he thought of what mattered more than any of it. "If this ends my career," JD said quietly, his voice filling the empty room as if spoken to the walls themselves, "so be it." There was no bitterness in the words, no regret, only the clarity that came from knowing he had stood where he was meant to stand. His fingers found the lapel of his jacket, and with a steady hand, he pinned the badge there, the metal cool but solid, a symbol not of office or title, but of the people he'd chosen to fight for. The city beyond the glass glowed in the deepening twilight, the Capitol lit as if to remind all who saw it of the ideals it was meant to uphold. JD stood in its shadow, but he felt no smaller for it. The resolve that had carried him through the storm remained, quiet but unshaken. And as night fell over Washington, JD Vance remained at his post, ready for whatever came next. A man unchanged by victory, unbroken by the cost. The morning after the vote, long before the day's headlines had finished their endless spin, JD's speech was already being replayed in places far from the Capitol. In a small-town classroom, rows of students sat watching the footage on an old television, wheeled in by a civics teacher who understood that some lessons couldn't come from textbooks alone. The room was still, the usual hum of whispered side conversations gone, as JD's words filled the space. Words about courage, about choice, about what it meant to stand for something when standing came at a cost. The students watched with wide eyes, some leaning forward, some frowning in thought. The teacher said nothing as the video played, knowing that the silence was part of the lesson. When the final words faded and the screen went dark, the room remained quiet for a beat longer, as if the weight of what they'd heard needed time to settle. From the back of the room, a boy no older than 12 whispered the thought that had taken root in more than one young mind that morning. "I want to be like him." The teacher smiled, not in amusement, but in understanding. He glanced at the boy and then at the rest of the class, seeing in their faces the flicker of something too rare these days. Belief that one voice could still matter. "Then remember this moment," the teacher said softly. "Remember what it looks like when someone chooses to do what's right, even when it's hard." The lesson that day went beyond civics. It became a conversation about duty, about choices, about the kind of country they wanted to inherit. And long after the bell rang, long after the students left, the words stayed with them, the way all true lessons do, waiting quietly to shape the future. While the boy in that classroom made his quiet vow, JD walked the streets of Washington as the first light of dawn touched the city. The Capitol stood behind him, its dome a silhouette against the pale sky, the marble still as cold and grand as ever. The streets were mostly empty at this hour, the city's usual clatter of power not yet begun. JD welcomed the silence. It gave him space to think, to feel the ground beneath his feet, to remember that for all its grandeur, this place was just another patch of earth, given meaning only by what people chose to make of it. He moved slowly, not out of weariness, though the weight of the past days clung to him, but out of purpose. Each step felt deliberate, a reminder that standing for something didn't end with a vote, with a speech, or even with victory. It was a choice that had to be made again each day, in quiet ways when no cameras watched, when no crowds cheered. JD's hand brushed the union pin still fixed to his lapel. Its presence steadied him, reminding him of the promise it carried, of the voices it represented. The city around him stirred to life, windows glowing, traffic beginning to hum, the day's business already pressing in. But for this moment, JD allowed himself the peace that came from knowing he had done what he could, that he had met the storm head-on and emerged with his soul intact. He paused at the edge of a small park, watching as the light grew stronger, casting the city in gold. His final thought as the day began was simple, but true. We're not saved by noise, but by those who care enough to fight. And with that, he turned back toward the Capitol, ready to face what the new day would bring. Later that same day, JD stood before a crowd that had gathered not because they were told to, not because it was expected, but because they wanted to. The rally had grown from a few voices into a sea of faces. Families, workers, students, retirees, all drawn together by the belief that what had happened in the Senate was not just a political moment, but a promise kept. Signs waved above the crowd, some hand-painted, some hastily scrawled on cardboard, but all carrying the same message, that courage was still possible, that hope was still worth holding. JD stepped to the microphone, pausing as the cheers rose and fell, letting the sound remind him of who he served. He didn't raise his hands, didn't call for quiet. The crowd quieted on its own, eager to hear him speak, to hear what came next. "This isn't my victory," JD began, his voice carrying clear and steady across the square. "It's ours. Every one of you who refused to give up, who refused to be silenced, who believed that we could be better. This belongs to you." The cheers came again, but JD continued, wanting the words to land before the noise returned. "I stood in that chamber because of you, because of the towns that were left behind, because of the workers who were told they didn't matter, because of families who still believe that a nation is only as strong as the promises it keeps." He spoke without notes, from the heart, and the people heard it. His words weren't polished or perfect, but they were true, and that truth carried farther than any slogan could have. He spoke of what came next, of the work still to be done, of the fight still ahead, of the need to stay vigilant, to stay united. And with each word, the crowd felt the hope that had flickered now burned stronger, a light against the shadows of doubt that had so long covered their towns, their homes, their lives. When JD stepped back at last, the cheers rose again, louder, stronger, carrying the promise of this moment forward into the days to come. He stood quietly for a moment longer, letting the sound wash over him, not as celebration for himself, but as a reminder of who he fought for and why he would keep fighting. And as the rally drew to a close and the people began to scatter, JD Vance remained, watching, listening, knowing that this was not the end of the story, but the beginning of what came next. This story reminds us that true leadership is measured not by titles, but by the courage to stand for what's right, even when standing alone. JD's journey shows that change begins with one voice refusing to be silenced. In the end, hope endures because people dare to care. What would you choose? To follow the easy road or to stand for something greater when it truly matters? Let's reflect together. If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.